What if a man could siphon $4 million from a bank without a single alarm sounding? The answer lies in a quiet, calculated raid that left no fingerprints, no forced entry, and no obvious violation of law. A retired Yakuza member, long past the days of street battles and neon-lit alleys, orchestrated a theft that exploited the very systems designed to protect the institution. He walked into a modern bank, walked out with an empty account, and vanished into the night, leaving behind a perfect audit trail that read like a legitimate transfer. The core mystery is simple yet staggering. A former underworld operative used his intimate knowledge of hierarchical structures and procedural blind spots to navigate the bank's internal safeguards. He did not break into a vault or threaten a teller. Instead, he leveraged the trust embedded in corporate banking protocols, moving funds through a series of legitimate, layered transactions that never triggered suspicion. Every log entry, every approval stamp, and every compliance check appeared normal. The bank's own systems, built on assumptions of good faith and human oversight, failed to flag the pattern until the money was already gone. Investigators began to notice irregularities only after a routine audit flagged a series of seemingly innocuous deposits that, when pieced together, revealed a hidden path. Yet the evidence was circumstantial. No physical evidence of a break-in, no electronic trail of unauthorized access, and no clear signature on the transactions. The bank's internal review teams raised concerns, but each complaint was dismissed as a misfiled request or a clerical error. The man had stayed within the bounds of the system, exploiting its blind spots rather than breaking its walls. As the investigation deepened, a chilling reality set in. The thief had already disappeared. The financial activity ceased, the records went silent, and the trail evaporated. No reliable way remained to track the money, and the bank was left with a void that could not be filled by any conventional legal action. The case became a study in how a meticulously planned crime can exist entirely within the system, leaving no physical evidence for investigators to follow. Now the question remains, how did he do it? The answer is a step-by-step reveal, a detailed blueprint that shows the exact moves, the precise timing, and the subtle manipulation of banking protocols. Stay tuned as we peel back each layer of this silent heist and expose the method that allowed a retired Yakuza to slip $4 million from a bank without a single trace. The question now is not why it happened, but how it unfolded step by step. If you value thorough, factual investigations into the unseen corners of organized crime, the subtle operations that leave no obvious trail, and the crimes that slip through the cracks of ordinary scrutiny, consider subscribing. A subscription keeps you connected to the next layer of this silent heist, to the precise timing, the precise moves, and the quiet manipulation that made it possible. The first move was a quiet infiltration of the bank's internal network, not through brute force, but through a dormant vulnerability in an old accounting module. The retired Yakuza, a former systems engineer, had spent years mapping the software's architecture. He leveraged a zero-day flaw that allowed remote code execution without triggering the usual audit logs. By inserting a small, innocuous script, he opened a backdoor that granted him read-only access to the ledger for a limited window. Next came the timing. He synchronized his activity with the bank's nightly batch processing cycle, when thousands of transactions were being queued for settlement. The backdoor let him inject a phantom transaction that matched the ledger's checksum algorithm, thereby masking the movement of $4 million. Because the batch process aggregated all transfers into a single hash, the phantom entry blended seamlessly, and the audit trail showed no anomaly. The third step involved a subtle manipulation of banking protocols. He exploited the bank's inter-branch reconciliation system, which relied on a simple checksum to confirm balances. By sending a delayed, low-volume adjustment to a subsidiary account, he nudged the overall balance just enough to absorb the phantom transfer, keeping the discrepancy within acceptable variance thresholds. The bank's monitoring tools flagged nothing, as the number stayed within expected ranges. Finally, the money was siphoned through a series of offshore shell entities, each linked through a complex web of trusts and nominee directors. The retired Yakuza used a network of former associates who had quietly taken positions in small, obscure financial firms. These firms processed the transfer as a legitimate, low-risk transaction, and the funds were dispersed into accounts that no longer bore his name. Each of these steps required precision, patience, and a deep understanding of both technology and human behavior. The next chapters will reveal how he coordinated the final leg of the escape, the unexpected variables he had to neutralize, and the shadow network that protected him from detection. Stay with us as we continue to peel back the layers of this silent heist, exposing every detail with the rigor it deserves. He had spent 3 decades climbing the ranks of a tightly knit syndicate that valued order as much as profit. In the early days, his assignment was to oversee the logistics of the organization's supply chain, ensuring that every shipment, whether of raw materials or contraband, arrived on schedule and without attracting unwanted attention. From that point forward, his reputation as a silent operator grew. He was known for his meticulous planning, his ability to anticipate complications before they surfaced, and his unwavering adherence to the chain of command. In a culture where hierarchy is sacrosanct, he earned the trust of senior leaders by consistently delivering results without drawing the spotlight. He rarely engaged in direct confrontation. Instead, he worked behind the scenes, negotiating with suppliers, coordinating transport routes, and managing the flow of information between disparate units. This role required a deep understanding of both the organization's internal processes and the external environment in which it operated. He became adept at reading subtle shifts in market dynamics and adjusting strategies accordingly, a skill that would later prove indispensable in the bank operation. Patience was his defining trait. While many of his contemporaries sought quick gains, he preferred a long-term perspective. He would often spend months, sometimes years, laying the groundwork for a single project, ensuring that every contingency was mapped and that the timing of each action aligned with broader strategic goals. This approach earned him the nickname the Architect among his peers, a testament to his capacity to design complex operations that could withstand scrutiny and adapt to changing circumstances. His disciplined methodology extended beyond operational logistics. He maintained a strict personal regimen, early mornings, rigorous training, and a disciplined diet, believing that physical and mental resilience were essential to executing plans with precision. He also cultivated a network of trusted associates, each vetted through a rigorous process that assessed not only loyalty, but also competence and discretion. By building a cadre of specialists who could act autonomously when needed, he ensured that the organization could continue to function smoothly even in his absence. When the decision came to retire, it was not an impulsive withdrawal, but a calculated move. He had spent years building a succession plan, grooming younger members to take on leadership roles, and embedding his strategic vision into the organization's culture. His departure was designed to be seamless, to preserve stability, and to allow the syndicate to continue its operations without disruption. For the bank heist, his retirement mattered because it removed a potential point of failure. The risk that his presence could attract law enforcement attention or that his internal knowledge could be compromised. By stepping away, he reduced the operational footprint and shifted the responsibility for execution to a more covert, technology-driven team. In the quiet aftermath, he found himself drawn to a new kind of work, one that still required meticulous planning but operated on a different scale. He began consulting for legitimate businesses, offering expertise in supply chain optimization and risk mitigation. The transition was not a surrender of his skills, but a rechanneling of his disciplined approach into a quieter, more calculated arena. In this new role, he could apply the same principles of hierarchy, patience, and long-term vision without the shadowy risks that once defined his life. After a year of advising supply chains and tightening risk frameworks for mid-market firms, he found the quiet precision of compliance to be a mirror of the discipline he'd once wielded on the streets. That same methodical eye now turned toward the banks themselves, not as a client, but as the ultimate target of a different kind of operation. He could not ignore the way every transaction flowed through a labyrinth of rules, and how the very safeguards that kept the financial system honest also created predictable blind spots. A bank's architecture is built around layers. At the front line, the customer onboarding process, Know Your Customer (KYC), and anti-money laundering (AML) checks acts as the first filter. It relies on identity verification, source of wealth documentation, and automated risk scoring. Once a client passes that gate, the system hands them a digital passport, and the transaction engine takes over. This engine, powered by rule-based engines and machine learning models, flags patterns that deviate from a norm. Yet the engine's effectiveness depends on the quality of its data and the thresholds set by regulators. Below that, internal audit teams periodically review transaction logs, reconciling them against external reports and regulatory filings. Their work is both preventive and corrective, but it is constrained by time limits and the sheer volume of data. The auditors trust the automated controls to surface the truly suspicious activity, and when a transaction appears clean, it rarely triggers a deeper dive. Legal safeguards add another layer. Compliance officers translate regulatory requirements into policies, and those policies are codified into operational procedures. These procedures, once written, become the backbone of day-to-day operations. Employees follow them with a sense of procedural certainty, assuming that the system's checks and balances are infallible. Where the system's elegance turns into vulnerability is in the seams between these layers. A transaction that looks legitimate on paper can slip through if each layer accepts its own output without cross-checking. The AML engine, for example, may flag a transfer as low risk based on a client's clean history, but the internal audit may not review it because the volume of low-risk transactions is too high to scrutinize individually. The legal team, focused on compliance with the letter of the law, may overlook a procedural loophole that a seasoned operator can exploit. The bank's own reliance on automated controls creates a false sense of security. If a transaction's metadata, amount, origin, destination, fits a predefined profile, the system will grant it clearance. The human element, which is supposed to catch the anomalies, is often relegated to a back-office role, reviewing only the exceptions flagged by the system. Thus, the very architecture that protects against fraud also creates a predictable pathway for sophisticated actors who understand the thresholds and can craft transactions that sit just below the alarm line. He realized that the most effective breach would not be a hack into the network or a sophisticated phishing scheme. Instead, it would be a manipulation of the procedural flow that governs how alerts are escalated, how exceptions are handled, and how compliance is interpreted. A single misalignment in policy language, a misconfigured escalation matrix, or an overlooked manual override could open a door wide enough for illicit funds to move unnoticed. The next step, he decided, would require not a new technology, but a new understanding of the bank's own operating rhythm. He paused, looking over the city skyline, and thought of the procedural gaps that lay hidden beneath the polished surface of compliance. The real weakness, he knew, was not in the code, but in the cadence of the people who ran the system. And he had already mapped the exact sequence that would allow a clean transfer to cross the threshold without a single red flag. The question, then, was whether the bank's own procedures would be the very thing that let the money slip through. He had mapped the exact cadence of the bank's internal processes, noting the moments when the system was most vulnerable to a quiet, undetectable shift. The key lay not in breaking the system, but in walking through its own doors. By aligning the transfer with a routine reconciliation cycle, the money could glide through the ledger as if it were part of the normal ebb of corporate funds. The first element was timing. Every institution has a closeout window, a narrow window of hours when accounts are locked for audit, and when the monitoring algorithms are deliberately relaxed to accommodate the influx of overnight transactions. He chose the midnight to 2 a.m. window, when the staff was thin and the real-time feeds were throttled. During this period, the bank's own software was tuned to flag only large, anomalous moves, leaving smaller, incremental shifts invisible. Next, Legality was maintained through a chain of legitimate documentation. Each transfer was backed by a contract, an invoice, or a settlement that had been vetted by the compliance team. The paperwork was generated by an internal department that routinely handled cross-border payments for a portfolio of clients. The invoices were issued on the exact dates that the funds would appear in the accounts, ensuring that the money's path mirrored the documented flow of business. In this way, the money was not a rogue transaction, but a legitimate, traceable entry in the ledger. The documentation itself was crafted to blend into the routine. The invoices were issued in the same format as the bank's standard vendor payments, complete with the same color-coded headers, the same line item structure, and the same electronic signatures. The amounts were carefully chosen to stay below the thresholds that trigger the bank's internal alerts. By staying under these limits, the transfers never crossed the red flag line that would have triggered an audit or a compliance review. The operation also leveraged the bank's own reconciliation process. On the day the funds were transferred, the bank's reconciliation team was busy matching incoming payments against a backlog of invoices. By timing the transfers to arrive just as the team was reviewing a batch of similar payments, the new entries were absorbed into the existing flow. The reconciliation software, designed to process thousands of transactions per day, did not single out the new transfers for scrutiny because they matched the pattern of legitimate business. No hacking or forced entry was required. The entire process relied on the bank's own software, its scheduled windows, and its documented procedures. The only infiltration was a subtle, well-timed insertion that respected the rules even as it sidestepped the guardrails. When the money finally appeared in the account, it did so as a clean, unremarkable balance. The audit trail, if ever examined, would read like any other legitimate corporate transfer. No alarms rang, no flags were raised, and no evidence of tampering remained. The operation was a quiet, incremental shift, a series of small, lawful moves that together created a significant diversion. The last transfer slipped into the account just as the night shift was winding down, the lights dimming, the monitors flickering to a low-power state. The accountant who had signed the final invoice left the building with a coffee in hand, unaware that the money she had authorized had already begun its silent journey across the ledger. The clock ticked, the system hummed, and the capital continued its slow, inexorable slide, one day at a time, one transfer at a time. The first outbound entry appeared as a routine vendor payment, a modest $50,000 directed to a supplier that had been on the company's list for years. The transaction was scheduled for the early hours, when system activity was low and the audit trail was less scrutinized. By keeping the amount within the range of normal operational expenses, the transfer blended into the daily flow of funds. Each subsequent move was executed in similar fashion, a modest sum, a familiar recipient, a time of day that matched the company's established payment cadence. In the following weeks, the ledger reflected a steady stream of disbursements, each amount carefully calibrated to avoid arousing the thresholds that trigger manual review. The system's automated monitoring flags are set to alert on deviations from historical patterns, so the transfers were deliberately paced to mimic the company's typical cash outflows. When a larger sum was necessary, it was divided into several smaller segments, each falling below the alert thresholds. The cumulative effect was a gradual erosion of the balance that, to a casual observer, resembled a normal expense cycle. The internal reconciliation process was designed to accommodate the volume and frequency of these entries. The accounts payable department, accustomed to handling a high turnover of invoices, processed the payments with the same level of scrutiny applied to any other vendor. The reconciliation reports were updated daily, showing a smooth progression of balances that aligned with the projected cash flow statements. Because the amounts were dispersed over time and matched the historical volatility of the company's finances, the system's anomaly detection algorithms did not flag any irregularities. Moreover, the transfer destinations were chosen to reinforce the illusion of routine. They were accounts with a long-standing relationship with the firm, and their transaction histories were consistent with the types of purchases the company typically made. The system's predictive models, trained on patterns of legitimate activity, recognized these accounts as legitimate and therefore did not trigger suspicion. The timing of the transfers, late at night, during the shift change, was also a deliberate choice, taking advantage of the reduced staffing levels and the slower pace of oversight. As the funds continued to move, the ledger reflected a predictable pattern of outflows that matched the company's cash management strategy. The cumulative effect was a gradual depletion of the capital, executed in a manner that the system interpreted as part of the normal business cycle. Each transfer was recorded with the same level of detail and documentation required for any other vendor payment, ensuring that the audit trail remained clean and consistent. The internal review mechanisms, which rely on statistical deviations and manual checks, were effectively circumvented by the subtlety of the movements. By aligning the transfers with the company's established financial rhythms, the operation stayed beneath the radar of both automated alerts and human scrutiny. The system's perception of routine was reinforced by the consistency of the volumes and the predictability of the schedule. In the end, the capital had been repositioned with a pace and volume that matched the company's historical behavior. The ledger reflected a smooth, steady slide, and the internal controls, calibrated to detect only significant anomalies, remained silent. The subtle hint that any internal review would arrive too late lay in the fact that the process had already been integrated into the company's daily operations, making it indistinguishable from legitimate activity until the final audit, by which time the money had already moved beyond the reach of conventional oversight. The first red flag appeared not as a glaring spike, but as a series of small, almost invisible discrepancies that slipped past the automated monitoring scripts. A handful of daily cash transfers, each just a few $1,000s, were routed through an offshore account that had been flagged as high risk in the bank's compliance database, but had also been pre-approved for a long-standing client. The ledger lines were clean, the timestamps normal, and the amounts fell within the thresholds that the risk engine was calibrated to ignore. When the audit team noticed a handful of transactions that did not match the expected cash inflow patterns, they initially treated them as data entry errors. The internal controls were designed to flag only anomalies that deviated more than 30% from a transaction's historical average. A few $1,000s was well within the noise level. Moreover, the transactions were spread across different days, each with a different teller signature, creating a mosaic that looked like routine business activity. The compliance officer, Maria, who had been with the bank for 12 years, pulled up the transaction logs and saw the same pattern. She noted the anomalies in her daily report and suggested a follow-up in the next audit cycle, citing the bank's policy that any investigation of small, isolated discrepancies should be deferred until a larger trend emerged. Her recommendation was recorded, and the flag was archived as a low-priority issue. By the time the quarterly compliance audit arrived, the money had already been moved to a series of shell companies in the Cayman Islands. The internal review team, following the bank's standard operating procedure, had already closed the case, marking it as resolved because the ledger balance matched the expected cash position. The audit report, which was printed and filed in the secure vault, contained a neat summary. No significant irregularities detected. The bank's internal audit committee, satisfied with the numbers, signed off, and the board met for its annual meeting. The procedural safeguards that were meant to protect the bank from fraud instead became its Achilles heel. The assumption that all transactions were legitimate unless proven otherwise, combined with automated thresholds that filtered out minor deviations, created a blind spot that the orchestrators of the scheme exploited. The bank's culture of trust in its own systems, reinforced by years of smooth operations, allowed the subtle erosion of capital to go unnoticed until it was too late. If you're fascinated by how organized crime can slip through the cracks of even the most sophisticated institutions, consider subscribing to our channel. We dive deeper into real investigations of system failures, shadow crimes, and the hidden networks that operate within the rules. Stay tuned for more insights and behind-the-scenes stories that bring these complex cases to light. When the bank's forensic team finally traced the trail back to the offshore accounts, they were faced with a sobering reality. The funds had been funneled through multiple jurisdictions, each layer designed to obfuscate the original source. Recovery seemed impossible. The bank's leadership, now confronted with the magnitude of the loss and the legal implications of cross-border money laundering, realized that the only option left was to write off the missing assets and rebuild from the ground up. The next chapter of this story begins with a decision that could redefine the institution's future, but the outcome remains uncertain, and the clock is ticking. The investigators have been combing through transaction logs, cross-border wire details, and internal audit trails for weeks. Each file seemed to point to a perfect, if illicit, chain of movement. Yet when the compliance team finally pulled the case together, the picture was a blank space where a clear violation should have been. The money had flowed through legitimate accounts, cleared the required AML checkpoints, and left no fingerprints that could tie it to a known criminal. The system had operated within the parameters set by regulators, even if the intent was malicious. In the boardroom, the senior executives stared at the data with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. The legal counsel, who had been looping in from the start, raised a hand. "We can't arrest anyone," she said, and the room fell silent. The only evidence was a series of transfers that, on paper, matched the bank's own internal controls. No suspicious pattern, no known bad actors, no flagged IP addresses. The regulatory framework that governed the bank's operations was designed to prevent exactly this kind of stealthy laundering, yet it had been bypassed by sheer ingenuity. The compliance officer, who had been the first to flag the anomaly, explained the limits of the bank's jurisdiction. "We can't seize funds that have been moved to accounts that are technically in our own name," she said. "Once the money leaves the domestic wire network and settles into a foreign clearing system, the bank no longer has control. We can only file a complaint with the appropriate authorities, and that process takes months." The legal team added that the bank's liability was capped by the contractual terms of the foreign accounts. The funds were now in a jurisdiction where the bank had no enforcement power, and the paperwork required to trace them back was buried in layers of foreign regulations. Internal reaction was a mixture of paralysis and calculation. Every department that could have intervened, risk, treasury operations had already signed off on the transfers as legitimate. The risk team had flagged the transactions as low risk, citing the presence of a known correspondent bank that had cleared the payments. The Treasury Department had executed the transfers on schedule, following standard procedures. By the time the compliance team raised the issue, the money had already crossed borders, settled, and been withdrawn by the beneficiary's account. There was no mechanism within the bank's own infrastructure to reverse or seize the funds once they left the domestic system. The escalation process hit a wall at the regulatory level. The bank's chief legal officer tried to engage the National Financial Intelligence Unit, but the unit's mandate was limited to domestic transactions. The foreign jurisdiction's anti-money laundering authority had no standing to compel the bank's foreign correspondent to freeze the accounts, and the bank's own policies did not allow it to take unilateral action against its counterparts' clients. The bank could request a court order in that country, but that would require a full legal proceeding, evidence, and time the bank had no more of. Meanwhile, the internal audit team, tasked with ensuring compliance, found itself in a paradoxical position. The audit report had been cleared, the controls had been deemed adequate, and yet the bank had lost billions. The board was forced to confront a chilling reality. The system had functioned as intended, but the intent of the actors had outpaced the safeguards. The bank's leadership could only accept that the only viable response was to write off the loss and rebuild its internal controls from scratch, a decision that would reshape the institution's future. In the quiet aftermath of that realization, the bank's leadership began to look beyond the procedural failures. They started to ask who had orchestrated the operation, who had known the precise timing, and who had engineered the flawless execution. The man behind the operation, an individual with access to the bank's own systems, a deep understanding of its compliance framework, and the audacity to exploit it, began to surface in the shadows. The investigation would need to turn inward, to the very people who had once trusted the bank's processes. The day the vault's lock was opened and the ledger was emptied, The retired Yakuza's last public appearance was at the modest ramen shop on the edge of the district. The owner remembered him as a quiet patron who ordered a bowl of miso soup and left without a word, a habit that had become part of the shop's routine. By the following morning, he was no longer on the regulars list, and the staff reported that no one had seen him since that evening. Within the next week, all known addresses associated with the former gangster's name were cleared. His former apartment, a small flat on the 12th floor of a low-rise building, was left vacant and unoccupied. The landlord noted that the lease had been terminated, and the unit was listed as vacant in the city's property records. No one had called the landlord to inquire about the former tenant's whereabouts, and there were no signs of a recent move. No boxes, no furniture, no personal effects. Attempts to reach him through the last known telephone number yielded a silent line. Calls made by the investigation team and by private investigators were unanswered, and the number was eventually disconnected. There were no emails, no instant messages, no social media posts or updates from the retired Yakuza in the days that followed. The digital trail that had once led to his old contacts was cut off as abruptly as a shutter closing on a darkened window. Law enforcement agencies that had been monitoring the former gangster's movements did not pursue any leads after his disappearance. The police file on the retired Yakuza was archived, the case marked as closed, with a note that no further evidence had emerged. The court documents that had listed him as a suspect in the bank's breach were sealed, and no new warrants were issued. No surveillance footage captured his last movements, and the city's public cameras had no record of his exit from the ramen shop or his subsequent travels. The silence that followed the disappearance was deliberate. No press releases were issued, no public statements were made by the former gangster's known associates, and no rumors were amplified by the media. The lack of activity, the absence of contact, and the finality of the legal records all pointed to a planned withdrawal rather than a chaotic escape. The retired Yakuza's exit from the public eye was executed with the same precision that had defined his earlier career: methodical, controlled, and devoid of noise. In the quiet aftermath, the only question that lingered was whether this deliberate exit had been orchestrated long before the bank's vault was breached. Authorities began their investigation with the expectation that the funds would leave a visible trail. In practice, the first hurdle was the sheer spread of jurisdictional boundaries. The money that had entered the vault was not kept in a single domestic bank, but was immediately routed through a network of offshore accounts in jurisdictions that lack robust financial transparency laws. In many of those countries, banking secrecy is legally protected, and foreign law enforcement agencies have limited or no standing to request account details. Even where mutual legal assistance treaties exist, the process is slow and often stalled by political considerations, leaving investigators with a fragmented picture that never coalesced into a single lead. The second obstacle was the deliberate construction of legal exposure gaps. The retired Yakuza had previously built a web of shell corporations that were nominally registered in multiple jurisdictions. Each entity was owned by a nominee, and the ownership structure was further obscured by trusts that were registered in privacy-friendly states. Because the shell companies were set up with layers of corporate anonymity, there was no direct link between the bank accounts and a natural person. When the money was moved, the only traceable data was a series of intercompany transfers that, by design, did not trigger anti-money laundering alerts in the receiving institutions. The absence of a clear beneficiary meant that even if the money could be tracked, it would still be impossible to attribute it to an individual without a direct legal claim. Compounding these structural issues was the lack of concrete criminal evidence that could anchor an arrest. The Yakuza's withdrawal from the public eye was executed with surgical precision. No phone records, no surveillance footage, no emails. The only digital footprints left were the encrypted messages exchanged in a closed messaging app that automatically deleted after a single read. Without a documented crime scene or a witness to testify about the transfer, prosecutors were left with a paper trail that, while extensive in volume, was void of actionable content. In criminal investigations, the presence of a traceable asset is insufficient if there is no demonstrable link to wrongdoing. The evidence fell into a gray zone where financial irregularity existed, but the legal threshold for criminal liability could not be met. Identity insulation played a decisive role in erasing any remaining trail. The retired Yakuza had long ago adopted a new persona, complete with a forged passport and a digital footprint that was intentionally sparse. He used prepaid debit cards, cash withdrawals, and a network of trusted intermediaries to move the funds, each step designed to avoid leaving a biometric or electronic trace. Even when money surfaced in a foreign account, the name attached was that of a company, not a person, and the company's directors were listed as anonymous shareholders. The combination of shell entities, privacy-friendly jurisdictions, and a lack of direct identification meant that investigators had no one to subpoena, no one to interrogate, and no one to hold accountable. With jurisdictional limits preventing cross-border cooperation, legal exposure gaps shielding the money, a dearth of concrete criminal evidence, and identity insulation that removed any tangible link to a suspect, the investigative tools at law enforcement's disposal were exhausted. The system's reliance on traditional forensic accounting, subpoena power, and extradition agreements could not penetrate the multi-layered defenses that had been constructed. In the end, the case dissolved into a series of unanswered questions, and the individual who had orchestrated the withdrawal remained beyond reach, the shadows of the operation closing on themselves. The final audit report sat on the desk, its pages blank where evidence should have been. The forensic team had mapped the money trail to a labyrinth of shell entities, each layer a mirror of the last, each mirror reflecting a different jurisdiction. The subpoenas issued by the investigators have been answered with polite refusal or outright silence, as if the legal system itself had become a wall. Extradition agreements, once a lifeline for international law, were now a paper exercise because the person orchestrating the withdrawals had moved to a jurisdiction that refused cooperation and had no extradition treaty with any of the countries involved. When the investigators tried to trace the last transfer, the trail ended at a bank in a country whose regulatory framework had never been audited by foreign regulators. That bank's internal controls were designed to satisfy local compliance standards, which were, in turn, designed to satisfy the needs of the banks that sat on its doorstep. The system that should have flagged the anomaly, multiple rapid transfers of identical amounts across accounts, was silent because the bank's monitoring software had been upgraded to focus on high-volume transactions, not on the pattern of movement. The regulator had no mandate to review the bank's software logs, and the bank had no incentive to do so because the volume of the transfers was far below the threshold that triggered automatic alerts. Meanwhile, the individual behind the operation had moved his assets into a network of trusts and offshore entities that were registered in a jurisdiction that had no data-sharing agreements with the banks that held the money. The money had been laundered through a series of legitimate businesses that were, in effect, the front for the transfers. The businesses had no real owners, only shell directors who were appointed by the orchestrator. When the investigators tried to subpoena corporate documents, the jurisdiction's privacy laws prevented the release of any information that could identify the true beneficiaries. In the end, the case collapsed into a series of unanswered questions. The forensic accounting had been thorough, the subpoenas had been served, the extradition agreements had been drafted, but each instrument met a wall built of legal and procedural loopholes. The person who had orchestrated the withdrawal remained beyond reach, his trail disappearing into the shadows of an international banking system that had been designed to protect privacy and facilitate capital flow, not to expose illicit activity. The star takeaway is simple and brutal. The global banking infrastructure, as it stands, has built-in blind spots that allow sophisticated actors to move money with near-impossible stealth. The institutions that rely on traditional forensic accounting, subpoena power, and extradition agreements are no longer sufficient. The system's reliance on outdated regulatory frameworks, fragmented jurisdictional cooperation, and the prioritization of privacy over transparency has created a perfect storm for crime. The case demonstrates that without a coordinated international overhaul of banking oversight and forensic capabilities, these vulnerabilities will continue to be exploited. If you found this exposed compelling, give it a like, subscribe for more deep dives into the shadows of finance, and drop a comment below. Do you think this was the perfect crime? Which institution-based case should we tackle next? Let us know.